Thank you very much. Can I first get a radio check that people can hear me and that see my slides, please?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So yeah, a great segue there coming through Beth's report stuff and then through a Families Federation and sort of strategic down through tactical and into me as a carer. And from my perspective, I guess what I've got to up front say is, hello, I'm Lt Col Edd Gordon, and that sounds like I'm a big deal or something, but I wasn't born a colonel and I wasn't born a carer. And what I'm going to go through over the next sort of 20 minutes or so is a view of a serving carer. It's not the view. There are lots of the stories out there, but I think from what I've heard so far, everything rings through from my experiences to those that have been found in Beth's report and what was discussed by the Navy's Families Federation, but also probably a little bit in this upfront part is why do we think we're so special or different in the services? And quite frankly, I don't think we do. We experience a lot of things that any carer would experience. We just perhaps experience them more often and at further reach. And yeah, I'm going to go through a few things this afternoon to unpack a little of that. If my slide will move forward. So I'm going to go through a little bit of context, a little bit of policy, a little bit of my mind, and a few stories to give some flavour to that. But first, I thought it was important to show a bit of policy. So the top level stuff there, everyone on this call probably understands, the Care Act, Children's and Families Act, and loads of other stuff that government say you must do to look after carers in whatever your guys or organisation is supposed to do. And then in defence, we love a policy, we love a rule, and so we've got our own. So under there are some joint service publications and some Army General Administration instructions, and so what. So that's how we translate the top level legislation into the day-to-day rules and regulations to be used in the services. And I've used AGI 108 there, an Army version, but there are RAF and Navy versions out there. And I'll try not to be too derogatory about the other two services while I talk, because I acknowledge they exist and do add value sometimes. The key to all that, though, is there are policies and there are rules, but like all policies, they're only as good as anyone understanding them or knowing them, them being in date and them being linked to reality. And that's probably the same in any carer's world, but exacerbated by Defence's desire to be this perceived hierarchical, dogmatic, rule-based organisation. Both of the previous talkers spoke about the ability for a carer to do their day job and be a carer. And these policies are designed to enable them to do that. But as has already been discussed, there's no actual carers policy, and carers aren't necessarily recognised in Defence. And interestingly, in the Care Act, Ministry of Defence carers are listed in the same demographic as Romani Gypsies as a transient community. You can think what you want about that. And with a Romani Gypsy background, I'm able to comment on both sides of that. But taking all those policies, something that's really interesting is that the MOD, because of the nature of what our reason for being is, i.e. to strike on the Queen's enemies, close within kill, we have to implement the spirit of UK legislation. So not the word or the law, but the spirit of. And that's an interesting point to me. So I thought I'd pour my mind out onto a piece of paper. And a lot of stuff on there is what any carer would think, see, feel, or do. And I was trying to find a smart way to put this on PowerPoint, but in the end I just took a picture of it because I'm not that clever. But what I'm going to do is try and sort of talk us through my thoughts and my mind with some stories that will add flavour to that. And sort of backtracking a little, you know, at the start I said, why do I think we're different? And I said that we're not. But in my military career, which has spanned nearly 30 years, I joined as a private soldier. I've been on 11 operational tours. I've had 32 jobs and I've lived in 9 houses, none of which I chose. And why am I a carer? So my son Harry was born whilst we lived in Germany. He's the only person in the world with his particular condition. he was born in a German hospital where it took a Russian geneticist through a German doctor and 3 translators to explain to us, his family, that there might be something wrong with him before he was born. And like many people in that situation, not just the fact we're in Germany and isolated from our family, but in a young 22-year-old family in another country being told that you should terminate your child, and that appointment was at 2 o'clock this afternoon, was the sort of start of my understanding that life was going to be a bit different. But we're 21 years later, so that didn't happen. And I'm going to talk you through some of the carer stuff here that impacts on my military life. So these sort of highlighted areas are again things that everyone probably in the caring environment understands. So dealing with health organisations, the fact that money is an issue, and I don't mean I don't have enough, although I'd obviously love more. But I mean, the minute you work something as the disabled something, or it's the specialist whatever, it becomes 3 times the price. Housing is a huge issue in the military anyway, but then the minute you need it adapting, or you need it in a certain location, where you can't necessarily be where the army wants you to be, there's a level of compromise to be done by both parts, whether that's the army or the family. And we'll talk about that again in a minute. And the job, well, the nature of it I've already discussed. I've been overseas a lot and away from my family, and the nature of the job means that's what it is. And some people say, oh, that's what you signed up to. Well, I did, but I was 17, and I'm now not 17, and I didn't have any children, let alone one with additional needs. So doing the job is different, but it has to still be doable. And I've had a conversation with Beth before and with others that sometimes the nature of the forces is not appropriate to some families who need some extra support. And again, there's balance and trade-off there. Not everyone can always do every job. Moving round, what I'll do is I'll sort of concentrate on the top left and bottom right. So care and respite. So I said that earlier, we're as a military community, we are listed in the same batch of transient families as sort of Romani gypsies and other such demographics. So as an example, when I lived in Aldershot, it took 7 years for my son to get any respite whatsoever. Bear in mind, you normally only live somewhere for 2 or 3 years. We were quite fortunate in the sense that it ever happened at all. But you never come to the top of the pile. When you're a military family engaging with a new social services, health sector, education sector, they think you're going to be gone in a couple of years. You're not going to be around very much. So why invest resource? And that just has an exacerbating compound risk factor on the family. If we move across to the left there of the people you deal with, and again, any carer deals with social workers every day, GPs, teachers, blah, 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 blah. You can all read the list. And every day something happens. For instance, my son's wheelchair was left on a respite bus for a whole weekend because no one had the keys. How'd you lose or lock away a kid's wheelchair? Pharmacists change drugs because it's 32 pence per month cheaper. But they do it to a drug that has got a citrus flavour and Harry's got a citrus allergy. So 32 pence is the cost of my son's life in their neglect. These are things that any carer might go through. But as a military family, you also got an added layer of the chain of command, the requirement to deploy in operations at any time, the fact that you're not living in a house that you chose in an area that you wanted, the fact that you're dislocated from your wider family. All of these things just add extra layers of stress. What I want to do is just talk about a couple of stories. This is not the slide pack I thought it was, so bear with me. And I'm going to give you sort of 3 examples of extra burden on a military family that are caring. Going to war. So that's what the army does. It's what we train for. It's why you've got an army. And in 2003, we went to war in Iraq. I was a staff sergeant serving with the Black Watch battle group, deployed into the deserts of Saudi Arabia waiting to go across the border into Iraq to face an enemy that potentially had nuclear weapons and chemical weapons. The night before you go to war, you're all allowed a 15-minute phone call on a satellite phone sat in the desert. And it's all romanticized in the movies, but it's not quite like that. There is a queue of people waiting for the phone. And in that phone call, I phoned back to my family that were in Germany. And I knew that Harry was awaiting an operation to have his tonsils taken out. Pretty simple in terms of all the other things that have happened in his life. At the time, he was about 3, 4 years old. And in that phone call, I was told that he'd had some sort of blood tests done before the operation, and they'd found that he'd got a clotting factor issue and potentially had leukemia. They were going to do some more tests the next day, and no one really knew what was going on. And then I hung up the phone and I gave it to the next guy to talk to his family, and I walked back to my armored vehicle in the desert, and the next day we went to war. 19 days later, on the end of Bridge 4 in the city of Basra, at the end of the Battle of Bridge 4, there was a Times news reporter there who had a mobile phone, and I had the opportunity to call home and find out what had been going on. And it turns out that Harry was just bluffing, because that's what he's like. And he'd got a clotting factor disorder, but it wasn't leukemia. So it was a problem, but nowhere near as significant as all the other problems going on in his young world. But not many people have to spend 19 days at war in contact with the enemy, wondering if their son's going to live. So I would argue we are a little bit different because of what is expected of us at the drop of a hat as a community on behalf of the UK and its government and its people. I'll give you one more example before anyone says I'm being too miserable. And it's about equipment. Earlier, both Beth and the Navy Family Federation discussed that when you move houses, there are issues of moving between social services, educational systems, and health systems. And these people control the equipment. So my son Harry, has got a special bed. We lived in Hampshire. It's an £8,000 bed. It's pretty swanky. It's electric and it does fancy things. And it was bought by Hampshire Social Services for Harry after several meetings and discussions about whether we were worth the investment. And then later on, I was assigned to a job in Wiltshire, and the house I was moving to was less than an hour's drive, crossing one county border and using only one A road and one motorway. But the two social services from the counties decided that the equipment was owned by Hampshire and was going to be retained in Hampshire, and nothing was going to be used or given to my son by Wiltshire County Council until we lived there. So for a period of time, it was expected that Harry would have nowhere to sleep that would be safe, and that a second-hand bed that my son had at this point slept in for about 4 years would be recycled in some way. I don't know how, because it was built in that room. It takes a special engineer to move it. There are infection prevention control issues because of body fluids being on that bed, that no other child would ever want or need that particular piece of equipment. But nevertheless, that's how it was resolved, or thought to be resolved, in that I had a conversation with both councils and suggested maybe that Wiltshire would buy the bed from Hampshire at a discount rate, rather than going out and buying another 8,000 bed on taxpayers' money. So in total, £16,000. I can do that simple maths, even though I'm in the army. And therefore, the taxpayers' money would be used to a prudent manner. But no, that wasn't good enough either. So in the end, I had to get an MP involved, who got the two councillors and banged their heads together. And the pragmatic solution was that Hampshire would lend Wiltshire the bed until such time as Wiltshire bought a bed, and then it would be collected again by Hampshire. And I'm sure to this day it still sits in a warehouse in Basingstoke, not used by anyone, 10 years on. To add flavour to that bed that's now in my current property, and I'm about to move to Scotland, because that's a country rather than a county border, has got even more frictions. So still not sure where my son is going to sleep on our next assignment next year. So there's, you know, just a little bit of flavour of examples that military carers may experience. I refer back to the fact that it's a story, not the story, but hopefully there's some flavour there to give you understanding of what it's like to be a serving military carer. And just that final picture there, it's not all depressing. You're allowed to have fun when you're a carer. So that's me and my son doing Salisbury Park Run. We are the current 5K wheelchair assisted champions of the Salisbury Park Run. I know this because we're the only people who do it with a wheelchair, so therefore we must be the champions. And I'm absolutely open to questions, or of course we'll be part of the panel later. So thank you very much for your time and listening. And most importantly, thank you for coming on to this meeting, because by just being here, you're showing an interest in supporting people like me, or people that are the future me as a veteran, or are our fellow brothers and sisters out there that have served or do serve.